All right, welcome to Chapter 7, which is all about photosynthesis, which is all about chlorophyll. Chlorophyll? More like borophyll, right? Right, that's topical. Only more than a decade old. Leave me alone. All right, so some new info for this lecture. Here's an abbreviation I'll be using throughout the lecture. It is the Greek lambda, which stands for wavelength. The electromagnetic spectrum. I'll be talking about the electromagnetic spectrum a bunch. It is essentially all the light emitted from stars. And when I say light, I don't just mean the light you can see. There's a reason we call it the electromagnetic spectrum instead of the light spectrum, because light implies the light that we see coming out of the star. Whereas the electromagnetic spectrum is everything, which, as you'll see later in the lecture, includes a large variety of different things that you didn't know were emitted from stars. So it's more than just the light you see. Now, the particular wavelength of light determines what kind of light it is. So, wavelength. All right. Imagine two waves in the ocean, right? Ooh, there we go. There's my two waves. Now, wavelength is the distance between the two crests, right? The wave goes like this. Well, that's my crest. So on my two waves, that's the wavelength, the distance between two crests. Well, light travels as waves as well. And so wavelength measures the distance between crests. And you end up measuring that in some very small units, nanometers. That's right, when it was to the billionth. All right, so visible light is 350 to 750 nanometers. That's the range of wavelengths that encompass light that is visible to you. However, that's just a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. Here's a good picture of it. So see this little thing here, this is visible light. And there we go. What else is emitted from stars? Gamma rays. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry. Dun, 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 dun. I'm not going to explain it. Anyway, X-rays. X-rays are also emitted from stars. Ultraviolet light. You know this. That's why you put on sunscreen. But infrared is also emitted from stars. Microwaves are in fact emitted from stars, and radio waves are in fact emitted from stars. Radio waves are where you get wavelengths that are measured in units that you're more familiar with, meters. Microwaves are measured in millimeters, but down here it's pretty darn small. So, all right, definitions. Photosynthesis is the synthesis of glucose from carbon dioxide and water using energy from light. An autotroph, well, that's a term we use for an organism that can produce its own food. Auto means self, troph means feeder. So it makes its own food. So anything that undergoes photosynthesis is also an autotroph. Heterotrophs cannot produce their own food. In fact, they must consume something else in order to get the organic nutrients they require. So hetero, other, troph, feeder. So they eat other things. So whether that's something that's alive or something that was recently dead, it doesn't matter. It's just eating something else. It can't make its own organic food. It can't make its own glucose. All right. So, in what organisms besides plants does photosynthesis occur? Because I'm sure you're all familiar with plants. Throw out answers. I'm listening. Hearing some good guesses. Well, let's go through some. In addition to plants, you have kingdom bacteria. In fact, the bacteria can undergo photosynthesis. True bacteria and cyanobacteria. You might know cyanobacteria under a different name, blue-green algae. Blue-green algae are probably the first photosynthesizers that ever evolved. What's interesting is that it's thought that it was blue-green algae that caused oxygen to proliferate in the atmosphere. Remember in chapter 6 we talked about how cell respiration. Wait, didn't we? Yeah, that was in chapter 6. Anyway, I think I'm getting off the rails. That's 111 in the book. Anyway, cyanobacteria were the first oxygen-producing organisms. Because remember, photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide, water, and converts it into glucose with a byproduct of oxygen. So cyanobacteria, being the first photosynthesizers there were, lived in an atmosphere that was nitrogen and much larger amounts of carbon dioxide than there are now. And so that cyanobacteria used the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and started cranking out sugar and oxygen. And they oxygenated the atmosphere. And that's really cool because one of the interesting things is that in addition to paving the way for life as we know it, oxygenating the atmosphere created a massive extinction event. Because up till that point, life had evolved in an atmosphere that had a much larger amounts of carbon dioxide and very low amounts of oxygen. And so the increased oxygen in the atmosphere was toxic to a large amount of life. Pretty cool when you think about the unseen consequences, right? So cyanobacteria are phototrophs. They're autotrophs that use light. There's protists that also undergo photosynthesis. There's a protist called a euglena. So it's a little single-celled guy. And then in addition to that, we have algae and phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are the autotrophs of the ocean. If you think about it, when you get out into the open ocean, it's a few miles to the ocean floor, kind of a little too deep for rooted plants to be growing. So instead, what you have are phytoplankton, tiny little microscopic organisms that undergo photosynthesis. And they take the place of plants in the open ocean ecosystem. Closer to the shores, you may see something like a kelp forest. But guess what? That kelp forest, that is not a plant. Kelp is not a plant. In fact, kelp is a colonial algae. So that's pretty neat. So here's a variety of organisms. Here's ferns, which are plants as we know them. Then here are some phytoplankton, all these funky little single-celled green guys. Here's some moss, a plant, but you may not know it very well. Here's that euglena I mentioned, that single-celled photosynthetic organism. And here's some blue-green algae along the water there. And here it is microscopically. And you can see it's got these very compressed cells. And blue-green algae lives in these large chains of cells. So, kind of neat. Okay, so let's talk about the organelle in which photosynthesis takes place. We did that tour of the cell, so we know which organelle, right? Right? Huh? That's right. The chloroplast. So, what is the anatomy of a chloroplast? Well, in case you've forgotten it, a chloroplast has a double membrane, an outer membrane and then an inner membrane. Then they have the fluid-filled environment of the chloroplast, and that fluid is called the stroma. And then we have the thylakoid, which is a little membrane. The thylakoid is a little thylakoid membrane that looks kind of like a poker chip. It's like a hollow poker chip. And it's green. And each thylakoid, because it's just a little membrane sac shaped like a poker chip, has space inside of it. And that space is taken up by photosynthetic pigments. A pigment is anything that can absorb light. So, the thylakoid is like a green poker chip, and it's actually a membrane system. You actually get stacks of thylakoids that are referred to as grana. So, like I said, it's a membrane system, and so think of it like a little hollow membrane sac shaped like a poker chip, and that green color is due to photosynthetic pigments. So a grana is a stack of thylakoids. All right. So I just mentioned photosynthetic pigments. A pigment is anything that absorbs light. Let's talk a little bit more about the light-absorbing pigments in the chloroplast, because it's not one kind of pigment. In fact, there are a variety of photosynthetic pigments in the chloroplast, and they each serve an important role. So there's a primary pigment, and that primary pigment is essentially the most commonly found pigment, the one that is most numerous, the highest concentration, and that pigment is chlorophyll alpha. So there's my little Greek alpha. So chlorophyll alpha is the primary photosynthetic pigment. In addition to chlorophyll alpha, there are a variety of other pigments whose job it is to expand on the wavelengths that chlorophyll alpha can absorb. So we have chlorophyll beta, which is still green in appearance. Then we have the carotenoids. Carotenoids are red, orange, and yellow colored in appearance. Xanthophylls are yellow. Then we have the anthocyanins. Anthocyanins tend to be blue and purple in appearance. So, we know that chlorophyll beta is green, carotenoids are red, orange, and yellow, anthocyanins are blue and purple. So, let's see, what color of light do you think chlorophyll beta absorbs best? Yeah, you'd think green because it's green colored, but you're wrong. Completely wrong. Oh man, are you so wrong? I'm kidding. No, seriously. The color of a pigment is the color of light that is absorbed the least. So think of absorbing, for instance, let's use a metaphor here. Salt, when you stir it into the water, you might say that the salt is absorbed by the water. You don't see it anymore, right? So when a pigment absorbs a certain wavelength of light, you don't see that wavelength anymore. And so you can't possibly see that color. In fact, the color of an object is the color of light that is bouncing off that object. Because my eyes are here, here's the object, right? If the light gets absorbed, let's get into position where you can see that. Here's the object, right? Here's my eyes. If the light's absorbed, got absorbed. I'm clever. It can never get back to my eyes. However, if the light bounces, then my eyes perceive it. It has to get to my eyes after hitting the object in order for me to see the object. And so the color of light that bounces off is what color I see the object as. So I see chlorophyll beta as green. That means chlorophyll beta absorbs green the least. It reflects green. So, kind of neat. All right. So here's a slide where I talk a little bit more about that. Light can be absorbed, transmitted, or reflected, right? When it's transmitted, it passes through an object. So, light passing through an object, I can see the light as it passes through. And so I see that. When light is reflected, it bounces back, and I can see it. But when it's absorbed, the light is taken up by the object, and I do not see that light. So what wavelength of light overall is used the least by plants? Well, what color is a leaf? That's right, green. So the green wavelengths are used the least by plants. All right, so let's take a look at the role of primary and accessory pigments. The primary pigment, chlorophyll alpha, is one that nearly all photosynthetic organisms have, and it absorbs light energy. And then the accessory pigments expand the wavelengths of light that are absorbed. So they're just there to allow the plant to get more light absorbed than just the light chlorophyll alpha can get. So, talk a little bit more about the details here. So first off, the pigments absorb the light energy. And then a chemical reaction occurs. And that chemical reaction is 6H2O plus 6CO2 combined with energy from light yields C6H12O6, which is our friend, that's right, glucose and oxygen. So this is the photosynthetic formula. So let's talk a little bit more about that oxygen, right? So glucose is what the plant needs. That's its food. It's an autotroph. It's a self-feeder. So it's making its food here. What does it do with that oxygen? Well, it releases the oxygen to the atmosphere. Here's a good question. Where does the oxygen come from? Well, we have two options. Oxygen, let's see, that's a gas made up of two oxygens. We have two possible sources for it to have come from. We have 6 carbon dioxide, that's 6 carbon and 2 oxygens, or 6 H2O, 2 hydrogens and a single oxygen. Which one of these? This is a liquid, this is a gas, this is a gas, 2 oxygens, 2 oxygens. Any guesses yet? That's right. The oxygen released is actually liberated from water. Plants split water molecules in order to release oxygen, which is pretty neat. So, that's just all I had to, it's just neat. Also, you might need to know that oxygen is released from splitting water, because that could very well be an easy multiple choice or true-false question. All right, so details of photosynthesis. Let's get back to that. Here's 6H2O, and we're going to split this molecule. And when we split it, we release the hydrogen. And, well, what is it called when you release hydrogens? Oxidation. So water is oxidized, producing oxygen. Carbon dioxide, well, that's reduced, right? When you add hydrogen to something, so I've got my carbon and oxygen, and I'm going to add the hydrogens that I liberated earlier, I reduce it. So glucose is, or carbon dioxide is reduced into glucose. Kind of neat. You can see it works out pretty well, right? Here's 12 hydrogens right here. So when we oxidize water, we have 12 hydrogens hanging out. Well, glucose needs 12 hydrogens. Convenience. All right, then there's energy. So that's, of course, the energy from light. So once more, with emphasis, 6H2O plus 6CO2 plus energy from light yields glucose and 6O2. Bam. All right. We're going to talk a little bit more about that light energy in the next video. But I bet I've done at least 10 minutes. So we'll